Greetings, everybody, and welcome along. It is the 26th of March, 2024, and you join us today for a more detailed discussion of the destruction of Yugoslavia by US imperialism and its bloc allies. We had a bit of a discussion about this yesterday, and I thought it would be useful to examine it in a little more detail today, given that so much of what is going on right now can be understood much better by interrogating more thoroughly what went on back then. And I have something of an advantage because I can remember quite clearly the 1999 war, which was, of course, the war that was used to essentially deliver the final blow to Yugoslavia, and then the denouement coming after that was the overthrow of Milosevic in the year 2000. Again, done by via tactics and organizations which we have become very familiar with over the last 20 years. So we're going to be going into that tonight. And to do so, we will have to take a step back into the history of Yugoslavia to look at its earliest times in terms of the socialist period in Yugoslavia, dwell a little bit on the split with the common form, and then look at the quite dreadful mistakes that were made in Yugoslavia, along with some of the achievements, and then move on to look at what was the scheme of imperialism that they drew up against Yugoslavia and how did they enact it. And along the way, we will be meeting some of our old friends, including Slavoj Žižek, a man who got his start in politics, working as a presidential candidate for a liberal party that was receiving funding from US imperialism. So we will be running into various different characters, including, of course, him, the late and unlamented Christopher Hitchens, who was a big supporter of the destruction of Yugoslavia. And of course, that's entirely consistent with his earlier Trotskyism, though I would argue he never gave up Trotskyism, and he argued that as well. And we should take the man at his word. And of course, we will come up to the Kosovo War and look at some of what was said at the time about that, but also why that war was waged, and the misinterpretations of and the faulty analysis done by many in the left in the imperialist countries, what you would call the pro-imperialist left, regarding the role of Milosevic and other associated issues. So we will be getting to all of this. Now, let's just pause to say hello to those who are in the chat so far. If you haven't liked and shared the stream, be sure to do so. And we are live currently on YouTube and on X, or Twitter if you're going old school. So we have so far a message from Ben, who says, won't be around for this, but I'll be sure to catch up tomorrow. Best wishes from Hungary. Well, good to have you with us in spirit. Dr. Ahmed, greetings to you in Egypt. Lee, good evening to you. President Jesus is with us from the land of Gavin Newsom. Red Star Betty has joined us from the land of Durham. Grassy Knoll greets us from the home of the Wobblies. That's the IWW in Seattle, Washington. We have Jenny with us, and Putin's Shirt, who says, greetings from the Empire of Lies. Jawad is with us, as is Jay in Virginia. Red Star Betty says, with this sort of countdown at the beginning, I always think Garland Nixon is going to appear. You know why that is? Because me and Garland Nixon use the same program. That 30-second countdown thing, it's just the generic one that comes with StreamYard. Trid joins us. Salute to you. President Jesus says, I remember hearing as a teen how Yugoslavia was the model for how to wage a war. Well, from the perspective of the imperialists, it really is. It was perfect. In so many ways, and we'll come to the ways in which it was. Luca, good evening to you. Luca joins us from Perfidious Albion. Jenny, with reference to Zizek, says, it is, of course, completely justified that Yugoslavia was completely destroyed, despite the fact, of course, it gave me every opportunity I ever fucking had, etc., etc., etc. Davey joins us, and Potted Rodent joins us. Muniz is with us. Clinton Fraser is with us, and here is Morgan joining us from the Emerald Isle. And right, we will be getting into now the fate of Yugoslavia as the imperialists carved it up in the 1990s. Oh, and Otis has joined us as well. Good evening to you. So, the breakup of Yugoslavia is one of the first major news events I have clear reminiscences of. I can just about remember the breakaway of Croatia. And I can remember David Owen. If anybody remembers him now, he's the former British Foreign Secretary. He was put in charge of the EU's peace mission, which didn't achieve anything at all. And he was on TV constantly in the early 1990s. I remember the eventual peace deal over Bosnia, but I remember the way in which the Bosnian War was portrayed, and it's very, very similar to that which is going on in Ukraine right now. The Serbs were portrayed as basically demonic figures. These sort of barely human, in fact, completely inhuman figures who would be rampaging around these innocent Bosnian villages, slaughtering everybody in their path, murdering en masse. And of course, it would be foolish to state that the Serbian side there didn't commit atrocities. Some were committed, but we would also be neglecting our task if we didn't say that there was no side in this that were particularly clean in terms of that war. It was nasty and it was often brutal. But one thing we never saw on British television, of course, the bourgeois press would never show you, the atrocities committed by the Al-Qaeda men who had been brought in by US imperialism from their previous engagement in Afghanistan to fight on the Bosnian side. We were not told, of course, that many on the Croat side were straight up fascists from the old Ustasha organization, which it was so notorious for its brutality that it even apparently shocked the members of the SS in World War II. We weren't told about the Nazi past of Alija Izetbegovic, the president of Bosnia-Herzegovina, who, of course, was in an SS unit in his youth. We weren't told about the false flag incidents that have now been very well researched, and we've spoken about those before, that when we had Kit Clarenberg on the show on numerous occasions. The way in which the media campaign was waged against principally the Serbs, and the media campaign was waged against the Serbs, and they were demonized over and over again because the Serbs were the principal opponents to the complete breakup of Yugoslavia. There were others, of course, inside Croatia, inside Slovenia, inside Bosnia, but it's the Serbs who were consistently uniform in their defense of their defense of Yugoslavia, and that is, of course, why they were relentlessly demonized, and why fascists in Bosnia and Croatia were elevated to hero status, just the same way as they are now, just the same way that in Syria and Libya, jihadists were turned into freedom fighters. Again, all of this happened in Bosnia, or the jihadist element there was, to my recollection, largely ignored in the Bosnian War. Now, to understand what imperialism's scheme was here, we have to take several steps back through the decades to the end of World War II, the successful struggle that had been waged there by the communist organized and led partisans in what was and must still be regarded as a titanic and heroic struggle waged against the occupying Nazi forces, both the German fascists and the Italian fascists. And the leadership of Tito there has to be commended, because he was a very skillful military and political organizer. He was a great revolutionary in that particular time period, leading the battle against, I believe it was around about 250 odd thousand German troops were tied down constantly in Yugoslavia and then eventually pushed out, but not without assistance, of course, from the Soviet Red Army. That's something Tito always neglected to mention later. There was active assistance from the Soviet Union coming to the Yugoslavs, particularly towards the end of the war. So that's worth mentioning, as is, of course, the equally heroic struggle waged by the Albanian partisans under another figure with a rather mixed record, I think it has to be said, Enver Hoxha, another great revolutionary in World War II who drove the Italians to defeat, who tied down many Hitlerite forces, who established socialism in Albania through a triumphant struggle against the occupying fascist forces. So the Albanian and Yugoslav partisan wars are two of the genuinely heroic stories of World War II, or the Great Patriotic War, if you prefer. Now, I will need to shorthand slightly what happened afterwards, because if I will do a full episode on the Tito, or more accurately, the Yugoslav split from the Common Form. Calling it Tito-Stalin split is too very overly simplistic and personalizes things in a way that is a bit ridiculous, really. But the Yugoslav exit from the Common Form was caused by a variety of things, and what is important for us to consider here, though, is what it meant in terms of the building of socialism in Yugoslavia. And what that meant was, of course, that the imperialists in 1948, when this occurred, were desperately looking for breaches in the socialist bloc, any breach that they could manipulate. And of course, when it looked like a breach was going to occur between the Common Form and Yugoslavia, then the imperialists were more than happy to jump all over it. Because at that time they were just desperate that the what would have been a solid bloc going all the way from Poland in the north to Yugoslavia in the south, and leaving Greece as a sort of NATO outpost, as it became, rather isolated. Any breach in that wall would be most welcome, and so the imperialists jumped on this. And Tito leveraged this in terms of getting a military assistance from the imperialists. He also committed a number of crimes against internationalism and some straight-out treacherous things, such as siding with the US imperialists over the Korean War. That's an act of treachery. It must be always said that that was the case. He also imprisoned some of the best revolutionaries in Yugoslavia on the grounds of them being pro-Stalin. So when the Common Form said in the late 1940s that Tito was an agent of imperialism, they weren't entirely wrong. He was collaborating with US imperialism. He collaborated with US imperialism over the Korean War. He continued, Yugoslavia, let's not personalize it, continued to supply arms to the Batista dictatorship all the way through to the end. That's documented in the John Lee Anderson biography of Che Guevara, which, for all John Lee Anderson's political eccentricities, I still think that's a pretty good and very thorough and comprehensive biography of Che Guevara, John Lee Anderson's one. But it's mentioned in there that the Yugoslavs continued to supply arms to the Batista dictatorship all the way to the bitter end as part of their arrangements with US imperialism. The non-aligned movement itself was something that US imperialism was prepared to put up with in the 50s and 60s because, well, it contained some people who could be worked with by the imperialists to make sure they stayed away from, or didn't fall under, as the US imperialists would insist, was Soviet influence, including some other old friends, such as the Baathists in Iraq, were close to the Soviet Union at various different points, but also they were anti-communist. The Baathists in Iraq killed a lot of communists in the 1970s, leading the Iraqi Communist Party to go down a very mistaken road and end up agreeing with the US invasion of Iraq in 2003. But the US imperialists were obliged to swallow for a little while the rather bitter pill of the non-aligned movement, which of course Tito was central to forming. And so the charges of the Cominform in the late 40s also included some very hyperbolic things, such as that Tito was an agent of imperialism and had before that had been an agent of the Gestapo. This is patently false. And Tito committed a number of crimes that must be talked about, but he wasn't an agent of the fucking Gestapo. He wasn't a secret agent of German imperialism. This is a nonsense. This is something that was made up in the heat of a propaganda war. I see some people going around repeating this now, and like, you need to be able to discern what is real and what is not. What is real is that Tito did do a bargain with US imperialism. He thought he was securing independence between the Soviet Union and the US imperialists. What he ended up instituting was a particular form of socialism that was deeply compromised from the very beginning. So, and of course, you don't need to make anything up when Tito and his government sided with US imperialism over the Korean War. Don't need to make that up. That's really what happened. So the form of socialism that grows in Yugoslavia is always flawed, as it is to a large degree with regard to the people's democracy as well. And there's a lot of similarities there, but there were a lot of achievements too. The experiments in worker management of industry are, to this day, worth studying and learning from. The socialist system in Yugoslavia achieved certain things, such as a massive raising of the literacy level to, I believe, over 90%. And of course, the raising of life expectancy to be comparable to Britain and France and the imperialist countries. I think they raised it to 72 by the early 1970s. So there's certain things that were achieved there, and the standard of living for the working class and the peasantry went up. However, there's a certain number of problems as well, which included the fact that the constitutional arrangements of Yugoslavia were chopped and changed on numerous different occasions, but that wasn't the biggest problem. The biggest problem, I would argue, was that, of course, there were actually its biggest two problems. The political problem lay in the fact that the Yugoslav government headed by Tito relegated the role of the Yugoslav Communist Party. And of course, then it becomes the League of Communists rather than a communist party. So its role is diluted, to say the least. And the proper Leninist approach, which should have been applied, and it wasn't just Yugoslavia that failed on this, many countries did, was not applied in Yugoslavia, which as Stalin says in the Foundations of Leninism, it should be the case that the party is one with the masses at all times, that the cadre of the party are constantly interacting with the masses, constantly learning from the masses, constantly taking the leadership of the party to the masses, amending it as you interact with them, and then taking the ideas of the masses back into the party, and then coming back again with a line that's changed based on the experience of implementing the previous line. And there's plenty of examples, and not just in Yugoslavia but in other areas, where this wasn't done properly, where the party became, even though the state was still on the whole benefiting the working class and the peasantry in many countries, there was a distance between the party, or in the Yugoslavian case, the Yugoslav League of Communists, and the masses that only grew over time. So much so that even though the working class and the peasantry, again, many different Eastern European countries, didn't want to see the end of the socialist system or the end of the people's democracies when it came into the 1980s, they were not sufficiently engaged with the party and the state and weren't sufficiently brought up to a correct political level to be able to see the tricks that were being played by the so-called dissidents, the bullshit that was being served up by organizations like Solidarność or Solidarity, or the trickery that was going on in the disintegration of Yugoslavia, caused to a large degree by political failures of the leadership of the government on the federal level, and also the weaknesses of the party. The masses weren't engaged enough to learn from that. So to be able to draw the correct conclusions as to what was going on, and the leadership was clearly inadequate. And even though when you read like the Yugoslav constitution of the early 1970s, it all sounds great, but there was serious problems occurring, and the root of it lies in that weakness of political organization. Now, the weakness of party organization and the insufficient development of the class consciousness and the revolutionary consciousness of the masses in Yugoslavia. Same is true in Poland. Same is true in Hungary. Same is true in Bulgaria to a certain extent. And this is the reason why the working class can get misled in the 1980s. It's that fundamental political weakness. The other weakness is, of course, not just Yugoslavia, but we're going to use them as the example, that to fund further industrial development, Hungary, Yugoslavia, Poland had all joined the International Monetary Fund by the end of the 1960s and were taking loans from imperialism. And of course, imperialism promised all kinds of things when they made these loans, and that they could be the repayment terms wouldn't be too onerous. But of course, the imperialists are much more skilled bankers than anybody in the Eastern Bloc was at the time, and there was a level of political failure there where the government either didn't realize, or there were too many capitalist influences in these governments and they didn't care, that what they were doing was they were essentially mortgaging the country and its fate to the imperialists, who, of course, as if you have a proper understanding of these things, even towards a country and a system like Yugoslavia, which was from its split with the Cominform onwards, was always much more open to capitalist influences than the other nations in the old Warsaw Pact were. But even to a nation like that, imperialism was always going to turn on them in the end. But I think many in the Yugoslav leadership, not just Tito, but others too, thought that somehow they had reached some sort of permanent accommodation with imperialism. Of course, they had not. Now, if we turn to the problems that were creeping in the 1970s, the national question becomes a problem because, of course, there is a degree of uneven development in the country. There is, of course, the national question requires constant struggle, not bureaucratic fixes, which it seems like that's what the Yugoslav central government was trying to do, veering between centralism and more autonomy. But the big problem was that because they'd essentially mortgaged themselves to US imperialism via the International Monetary Fund, US imperialism in the early 80s starts to insist on various different changes. And here we bring in the work of Michael Parenti. If you read his book entitled The Death of Yugoslavia, To Kill a Nation, The Death of Yugoslavia is the full title. And you can find that fairly easily. It's hard to believe that Verso Books published that in the early 2000s. I doubt they would now. But what Parenti outlines in that book is that from 1984 onwards, the Reagan administration had identified the breaking up of Yugoslavia as a national security priority for the United States, meaning that from at least 1984, what we would now call a regime change option was being looked at actively. And because Yugoslavia has debts to the International Monetary Fund, of course, the US imperialists can insist on various different changes to the economic and political structure of the country. And the economic crisis in Yugoslavia in the 1980s continues to get worse. By the early 1980s, I think they had largely done away with the worker self-management system. partly as a result of pressure from US imperialism. Because, of course, the imperialists aren't stupid. Anything which can, even in small ways, create working class support for the system as it is, or raise the level of class consciousness, that's something which has to go. You have to create a distance between the existing party and state and the masses. You have to make sure that the masses are pushed into passivity and inaction. Now, what they planned to do, quite clearly, was to make sure that the national question got played upon, and they did that by all the way through the 1980s, insisting upon, and especially towards the end, like 88, 89, 90, that any further assistance with regard to the economic picture in Yugoslavia was essentially tied to so-called democratic reforms, which basically means that any authority that the Yugoslav government was exercising to suppress reactionary forces was lifted. This, you will be familiar with this demand from the US imperialists in many different settings. It's the same demands that they make of Russia today. It's the same demands they make of the Chinese. It's the same demands they made of Syria, for instance, and any other country that gets targeted, any other country that is successfully resisting the incursions of imperialist forces or organizations that are tied to imperialism. They demand that repression must be lifted, and that what that always means is we want freedom for our organizations to operate. That's all it means. It's nothing to do with free speech or anything like that. And this is what they were demanding of Yugoslavia in the late 1980s. So what they essentially demanded was that the various petty nationalist forces in Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia, and the other republics be allowed free rein in the elections. Any suppression of them be stopped, and then they were prepared to essentially offer financial assistance directly to the governments of the republics, not to the Yugoslav federal government. So what they essentially did was they offered assistance to these governments in the constituent republics of Yugoslavia while starving the central government of Yugoslavia, the federal government, of funds, whilst at the same time, as Parenti documents, the German imperialists, having now in 1990 occupied and carried through a comprehensive counter-revolution in the old East Germany, started flooding Croatia with weaponry. And this was with the specific idea of the German imperialists that they were going to, now they were reunified, carve out a sphere of influence in the Balkans for themselves. The French imperialists were all on board with this as well. The British were in there competing, though they were constantly worried that they were losing out to the Germans. But the Germans are in the mix right from the off, as are, of course, the US imperialists. But they got their aim, of course, when Slovenia breaks away first. It looks as if, for a moment, that the Yugoslav armed forces are going to make a move to stop this disintegration of the country. But essentially what happens is that the political leadership of the Federal Republic is nowhere near strong enough to resist this breakup attempt. And if you examine Parenti, you just go through Parenti's book, he documents this very clearly. The way that the breakup happened, you had the elevation of these so-called liberal and nationalist leaders constantly in the bourgeois press, even though that these characters had only come to power because imperialism had forced a rigged game for them in the last elections. Again, to go back to the political problem, though, the League of Communists in Yugoslavia kept growing and adding membership to it all the way through the 1980s. But again, what was the quality of that organization? How strong was it ideologically? Was it a proletarian party, or was it a party stuffed with various forms of opportunists? And unfortunately, the latter is more true, which is why the fight to actually retain Yugoslavia was always weak in these, particularly in like Slovenia and certain parts of Bosnia and Croatia, because the organization of the what was supposed to be the vanguard party there, the party of the proletariat, was very, very weak. Weaker, it would seem, in some areas than even the latter days of the CPSU in the USSR. Now, it was true that certain elements within the Yugoslav state were prepared to fight to retain Yugoslav sovereignty, mainly the military hierarchy. But again, they weren't backed up by the politicians. Now, the role of Milosevic is interesting because he emerges as somebody who does actually want to save what he can of Yugoslavia. And so he is a guy who was he was a banker. He was condemned by the British left at the time for being like a pro-capitalist politician, which is certainly the case that the man was no real revolutionary. He was a fairly standard late period Titoite cadre, meaning he was essentially a man who'd come up through the bureaucracy. He wasn't a revolutionary figure in the fact that he's not going to go out there making appeals to the masses. The way in which that generation of leader in Yugoslavia appeared to have been trained was as essentially a bureaucrat. But Milosevic did want to preserve what he could of Yugoslavia. He didn't want to see the country train wrecked. He didn't want to see it completely broken up. He wanted to preserve Yugoslav independence. He wanted to preserve the industrial base. He wanted to develop the country. And so he was forced to swallow, of course, the departure of Croatia, and he was forced to swallow the Dayton Accords on the grounds, which of course brought the war in Bosnia to a conclusion. It's worth mentioning at this stage that, of course, the Bosnian Muslim section of the country got a worse deal than they would have got a couple of years earlier from the Europeans, having been told to fight on by the Americans, simply so that the US could prove a point that the Germans couldn't and the French couldn't end the war without the US's say-so. So many thousands more casualties in order that US imperialism could flex its muscles against its supposed allies. But the Dayton Accords, of course, ended this particular period of the war. Milosevic, I think, by signing that and essentially agreeing to it, thought that he was getting breathing space to essentially save what he could of what was left of Yugoslavia, which was essentially Serbia and Montenegro by then, and to calm the situation down, to rebuild the country, and to start developing it again. And he was prepared to make a number of compromises with the imperialist countries in order to get what he saw clearly as the breathing space he required to start the rebuild. And of course, there was a lot of problems in Serbia and Montenegro. There were, because of the fact that the state had been weakened, a lot of clans, organized crime, various different dubious nationalist organizations had emerged. But Milosevic wanted to keep things together, and the Yugoslav National Army, Yugoslav People's Army, was still present and was still capable of actually keeping order to a degree. So he had every reason to think that after the war in Bosnia ended in '95, that he would be given the chance to actually run the country and, again, put it back on its feet again, which is what he clearly wanted to do. But imperialism, of course, had other plans, because the survival of Yugoslavia in any form was unacceptable to imperialism. The survival of any form of socialism at all in Yugoslavia or anywhere else in the old Warsaw Pact was absolutely unacceptable and needed to be destroyed. So Milosevic, even though you could adequately describe his politics as basically that of a social democrat, was unacceptable to them. Why? Because he wasn't prepared to see the deindustrialization and destruction of the economic base of the country. That's why they decided to remove him, because he wanted to preserve the sovereignty and independence of Yugoslavia. That's why it was decided in Washington especially, and London too, and Berlin and Paris, that Milosevic was unacceptable and had to go. Even though he'd been trying to cut deals with US and British imperialism in the period 95 to 99, the emergence of the KLA, so-called Kosovo Liberation Army, who had been around in various different forms going all the way back to at least the early 1980s. This has been well documented that they were descended from a terrorist organization that had carried out attacks against Yugoslav embassies overseas. There'd long been problems with these ultra-reactionary characters in Kosovo. And so when they popped up again at the end of the 1990s, it probably wasn't that much of a surprise. Initially, they were defined by even the US as a terrorist organization. And the thing to say about this is that the US initially defined them as a terrorist organization, but of course strangely changed their minds in later 98 to early 99. And what happens then is, of course, that the KLA step up their attacks on the Yugoslav authorities, and you see now a very familiar, looking back at this in retrospect, series of claims about ethnic cleansing, about genocide, about massacres start to be circulated. I remember these on like the 6 o'clock and 10 o'clock news in Britain. Tearful interviews being given, talks of massive loads of bodies found in ditches, as Sergei Lavrov pointed out recently. And he, now the Russian foreign minister, back then he was the permanent representative of the Russian Federation at the United Nations, and he pointed out in a recent comment on this that one of the most famous supposed massacres that was used to justify the bombing campaign was, in actual fact, something that there was a pile of bodies, but these were men who'd been killed in a gun battle, and that their military fatigues were taken off. Civilian clothing was put on them, and then this photo was staged and circulated in the Western press. So the atrocity propaganda, the atrocity pornography that the West has indulged in, of course, with regard to Ukraine, whilst covering up real atrocities in Israel, of course, committed by Israel. This was something they were doing constantly, and it was designed to whip up a storm to justify what they had long planned to do, which is the final breakup of Yugoslavia itself. And to do that, you had to essentially chronically weaken Serbia, being still the foundation upon which what was left of Yugoslavia was based. And you ultimately had to get rid of Milosevic and his political organization and his allies. So what they aimed to do was to use the Kosovo crisis to deliver a fatal blow to Milosevic, and then they hoped that this would lead to the collapse of Milosevic's government. Now, the way in which they went about this is they had to find a way to get what they wanted, which was the right to wage an unrestricted air campaign against Yugoslavia. And so they had to basically find a way to justify this by making it look as if the Yugoslav government had been too unreasonable and had refused a negotiated outcome. This is where we get the Rambouillet talks in a chateau outside of Paris, where there was supposed to be a peaceful settlement being negotiated, but at the last minute, of course, the British and the United States threw in the demand that as part of this settlement, the imperialist forces of NATO had to be allowed unrestricted movement throughout the entirety of Yugoslavia. So not just a peacekeeping force sent into Kosovo, but that the imperialists themselves had the right to essentially militarily occupy the entirety of the country. That was never reported, of course, at the time, but this is what was demanded of Milosevic. And of course, he could not possibly, and the Yugoslav government could not possibly agree to that. And the imperialists knew that damn well. That's why they put the demand in there. The aim was always to caused the Yugoslav government to have to reject this supposedly amazing peace deal, and then portray them as the unreasonable villains, and then start a bombing campaign. This is what they always wanted. And this is this is the hidden history. Again, Parenti chronicles this very, very well. So be sure to read that book if you haven't already. And then they start the bombing campaign, of course. Now, of course, the bombing campaign did not go strictly according to plan, because it went on for over 2 months, and it ran on and on and on, and the Yugoslavs weren't surrendering. Now, the only thing I want to add here to what I said just the other day about this was that it was touch and go, or it appeared to be, whether there was going to be any victory for NATO at all. There was a serious falling out. If not a falling out, then there was clearly an argument going on. And I can remember this even from the bourgeois coverage at the time. There was clearly an argument going on inside the NATO countries as to what they were going to do if essentially the Yugoslavs didn't crack. And they went back and forth on it. Blair, being a maniac and a sort of absolutely fanatical imperialist, was demanding of Clinton that a ground invasion be staged. Clinton was a lot less keen on the idea. He preferred his wars to be much lower risk. And if they had have staged a ground invasion, my prediction is that a direct fight with the Yugoslav army would not have gone very well for the NATO forces. It would have been certainly a lot more difficult and a lot more bloody than anything that they experienced in their imperial war in Iraq. So they didn't want to do that. At one point they were thinking of trying to essentially cajole the Hungarians into carrying out an attack on Yugoslavia for NATO. This is starting to sound familiar, this is because the cowardice of the imperialist countries when faced with even a diminished Yugoslav army, and the Yugoslav army in the period of in the Tito period and into the 1980s was something which, by all accounts, was very well organized, was well equipped with domestically produced weapons, had a very strong military doctrine, very effective officer corps, and a lot of this had survived up to the 1990s, even after the breakup of the country. And it would have been very difficult for NATO to wage a ground campaign, particularly in Kosovo. They would have found themselves in a similar situation to that which the Nazis had in the 1940s, which is it would have been very hard to take ground and even harder to hold it. So they didn't want to do that. So they went back to another weapon that imperialism has in its locker, which is, of course, aerial bombardment using depleted uranium, in the hope that this would essentially brutalize the population to the point where they cracked. That didn't happen. They then turned to the final weapon, which is, of course, the treacherous, ever treacherous role played by the Russian comprador bourgeoisie and their agent Boris Yeltsin. And of course, had the fear apparently of Milosevic and others was that if the war dragged on and the country remained blockaded into the winter, then there would be more and more serious problems over the heating of homes and, of course, the supply of food. And this was going to be a real problem, of course, unless they had powerful states that could come to their aid, and they didn't really have that. The Chinese and the Russians opposed the bombing campaign. The Chinese couldn't really do a great deal from the other side of the world, and the Russian government was split between those who were more in favor of a more proactive campaign to oppose the US imperialists in Yugoslavia, and those who wanted to just sell out at all costs in order to keep doing business with the West. And this is essentially, this side sort of won out in Russia, but there was an active military rebellion against Yeltsin by some officers in the Russian military hierarchy, who sent Russian troops that were stationed in Bosnia racing over the border to occupy Pristina airport. And this was done apparently in contravention of orders or without orders from Moscow. This, of course, escalated the crisis facing the Yeltsin clique, and eventually, of course, this is part of what leads to his removal from power later on in 1999, and of course, the emergence of Putin. And this is a crucial thing to remember because now, this week, 25 years after the bombing campaign began, the Russians tried to debate this at the Security Council, and the French blocked it. And why did they block it? Well, here we get to the fact that the case which they made, the US imperialists and their bloc allies made for bombing Yugoslavia, was always based on lies. There was, at the time of the beginning of that bombing campaign and immediately before that, there was no ethnic cleansing going on inside Kosovo. There was a terrorist campaign going on which the Yugoslav state was trying to suppress. And it was a terrorist campaign that had fired up intermittently over the previous 20 years. And this was presented as this, the demon Milosevic is targeting the innocent Albanians. But of course, it was, again, like an anti-terrorist action that was going on there against a terrorist army that was being directly coordinated by our old friends, the CIA and MI6. Of course, the pro-imperialist left, led by people like a certain Bernard Sanders in the United States, were all in favor of the bombing campaign against Yugoslavia, as were all of the what we would call the soft left and the Trotskyites in Britain, who did their usual two-faced act of agreeing with everything that the imperialists said about Milosevic, but then saying at the last minute, "Oh, but we don't agree with the bombing." So they would essentially back up every imperialist lie and say, "Yeah, but don't actually do anything. We agree with everything you've said, but don't do anything." That's the typical role the Trotskyites play in the anti-war movement. They are not anti-war at all and not anti-imperialist, and they proved that back then. Christopher Hitchens at least had the decency to be thoroughly consistent in his pro-imperialist positions, which he took the belief system first set out by Trotsky to its logical conclusion and became a rabid imperialist, which is, if nothing else, thoroughly intellectually consistent. So the point to dwell on here is that the case made by those on the left in Britain at the time as to why the Milosevic-headed Yugoslav government had to be opposed and couldn't be supported was that, he's doing deals with the capitalists. He's a capitalist himself. And, of course, elements of that were true. But, of course, because Trotskyites don't understand the fact that what we must focus on is, to use Mao's phrase, the primary contradiction in each situation. Primary contradiction in the case of Yugoslavia, and this has been borne out by subsequent history, is that the imperialists were looking to split up and destroy a version of socialism that had existed since 1945. However flawed, however compromised it was, and however many treacheries its leadership had carried out at various points, what had been created there was a version of socialism. And why the US imperialists were desperate to destroy it was because they couldn't allow any version of socialism, even one that previously they had to accept, because they wanted to contrast the wonderful free Yugoslavia with the evil tyranny of the USSR. But of course, when we get into the 1980s, the imperialists themselves are in a deep crisis. They need all forms of socialism to be destroyed, not just so that a good example or any example of an alternative system is destroyed, but so those countries can be comprehensively looted for their resources, have their industries destroyed and assets stripped, and of course their populations turned into migrant low-wage labor to be exploited elsewhere, which is of course exactly what has happened to the populations of the former Yugoslavia. So many Croats, Bosnians, Serbs, Slovenians, Macedonians, and Albanians, of course, have ended up in Britain, Germany, France, and other European countries, often working very low wage jobs for in ultra exploitative conditions, which is of course another reason why they wanted Yugoslavia destroyed. Access to the to millions more workers who can be exploited, and this is something which, of course, any communist or anybody who thinks themselves to be a communist should vehemently oppose. But of course, the Trots confused the issue, declared that Milosevic was the main villain, declared then that, well, maybe we shouldn't bomb, but he's certainly a villain. So, of course, acted to confuse and demobilize any support there might have been for opposing vigorously the imperialist war on Yugoslavia itself. And so, to go back to the idea of the primary contradiction, the primary contradiction dictates to us in the imperialist countries, going back again to what Stalin talks about in Foundations of Leninism. Our task as communists is to try and forge alliances between the proletariat in the imperialist countries and those who are in the neo-colonial world, the masses of the oppressed nations. Our job is to build solidarity between the working class, in my case, Britain, and the workers in Yugoslavia when it is under attack from imperialism. That is what we should have been doing back then. Now, I was barely politically engaged back then. But the fact that these contradictory fools in the form of the Trotskyites or out and out pro-imperialists were in charge of what was supposed to be an anti-war movement at the time meant that all that stuff never happened. These people ended up leading any anti-war feeling down a complete dead end. So the whole question of what happened to Yugoslavia afterwards then needs to be addressed, because of course then they dispose of Milosevic a year later. They claim that he rigged a presidential election. Whether he actually did or not is another question. But again, due to the compromises that Milosevic had made, they'd allowed almost unrestricted operations for what we now know as the NGO machine. If you're familiar with an organization named Otpor, that was a classic US and British influenced and bankrolled mobilization operation that recruited a lot of what I would define as sort of petty bourgeois youth to flood the streets and to essentially provide images for Western media to make it look as if a real revolution was underway, when in actual fact what is going on is a counter-revolution, which is that they'd bombed Yugoslavia, they'd attempted to starve it out under sanctions, they tried to immiserate the population to the point where they would rebel against Milosevic. Milosevic, of course, stages this election. The West's chosen guy was a guy called Kostunica, who claimed to be more of a nationalist than Milosevic. But then again, why was the West getting behind him so enthusiastically? The question must be asked there. And the idea being that they would remove Milosevic, they would essentially get rid of the last barrier to the comprehensive looting and destruction of the country. And that is indeed what they did by forcing Milosevic out. He was then, of course, shipped off to The Hague to face trial. And ultimately, he defended himself with some skill because, of course, he knew the case against him forwards and backwards, and unfortunately died in what are now deemed to be somewhat suspicious circumstances. And after post-mortem, he was actually cleared of the charges that had been brought against him, charges of complicity in genocide. Now, if you find a time, go and watch the Milosevic trial, the videos of it. You can find those on the Internet Archive site, where he's cross-questioning the various different characters that are called to testify against him. And he makes fools out of an awful lot of them, because they were blatantly lying in their testimony, or just like blatantly distorting things. General Wesley Clark, in particular, makes a complete arse of himself. So, the point here is that even a figure like Milosevic, who is not a revolutionary, I would say barely, certainly not a Marxist, but a figure who wanted to retain the industrial base, who wanted to redevelop the Yugoslav economy and keep it as a sovereign independent state, such a figure needed to be destroyed. And therefore, from our perspective, and those of us who actually wanted to counter imperialism, then we should have, in the same way that we would support the sovereign government of Libya or Syria, have supported Milosevic in the same way. And in my view, if he had managed to prevail in Kosovo in 1999 with all the odds that were stacked against him, had the Yugoslavs managed to prevail, then the world might be in a slightly better place today. Had NATO managed to be frustrated in 1999. But, as I said yesterday, had they frustrated NATO more, the chances are that NATO would have upped the ante, the US would have upped the ante and started doing even more aggressive bombing campaigns. But then again, that might have triggered more revulsion in the domestic population of the imperialist countries. So all of these actions have consequences. The fact is, though, we in the West were still far too influenced by imperialist propaganda. All of the major organizations that were supposed to lead anti-war movements were in fact pro-imperialist because they were all led by Trotskyites. And so therefore the movement against the Kosovo war was weak and misled from the very start. But we should again bear this in mind. When we look at the Kosovo war, when we look at the war on Iraq, and when we look at the war on Libya, war on Syria, all of these countries, what was their crime? Was any of them communist? Not really. There's arguments that significant socialist elements existed in the Libyan socialist Jamahiriya, and there's an argument to say that's a form of Arab nationalism or left nationalism or a form of socialism. But what's certainly true is that Milosevic, Saddam Hussein, Gaddafi, Bashar al-Assad had all tried to do bargains with imperialism at various different points, and indeed Gaddafi tragically believed that he had. But imperialism, of course, turns on them as quickly as a coin spins through the air. Because what the imperialists, and certainly the more serious of their strategists, know and understand is that, of course, any country standing outside the US-dominated imperialist bloc system that is not prepared to be completely asset stripped and destroyed by imperialism, then if a government gets in the way of the asset stripping job, then it has to be destroyed. Look at the job that was done on Libya. Even though Gaddafi and his government had tried to bargain with British and US imperialism, it was destroyed at the instigation of the British and the French in particular, because the French saw Gaddafi's role in Africa as being threatening potentially to their neo-colonial stranglehold over countries in West Africa in particular. And so Gaddafi, having thought he got a bargain with them, he found out he couldn't trust them. Because imperialism cannot abide by any bargain. It abhors any barrier to its ability to suck vampire-like the blood out of the veins of the peoples of the oppressed nations of the world. As Putin made that analogy, the vampire analogy, rather recently. So any government, even if it's done deals with imperialism, even if it's tried to compromise with imperialism, if it retains a shred of independence and sovereignty and the ability to stand outside of the system to any degree, has to be destroyed. The only thing that the imperialists will accept is complete submission and the complete destruction of the countries concerned. Look at what they have done with Libya. Let's go back to Yugoslavia. Look what's happened since then. A population decline, greater rates of poverty, mass deindustrialization, as Parenti points out in his book, and as has been confirmed recently. Blair and various other disgusting characters who were planning this were demanding more and more strikes against infrastructure, against industry, partly because they planned to asset strip and destroy all of the the benefits that was still in existence at the time of the old, at least semi-planned Yugoslav economy. All of the achievements of socialism had to be destroyed, and if they couldn't destroy them via economic means, they were going to destroy them via the old way, blowing them up, which is exactly what they were doing. Again, Parenti documents this very well. So this is an overview of what happened back then, and you have to understand what was going on in the 1990s and why. Once you understand properly that the composition of a government, it doesn't matter if it's communist, if it calls itself nationalist, if it calls itself Islamic nationalist or Khomeinist or whatever composition that you want to that it actually has. If it stands outside the imperialist system, or if it attempts to assert independence in any way, then that makes it a target of imperialism. And therefore, for us as people who see correctly imperialism as the primary contradiction in the world, then we have to defend that nation which is trying to assert independence. In as far as it is being attacked by imperialism, we must support it in its struggle against imperialism, which means, of course, you put aside secondary contradictions when doing so, and are prepared to make the case for the defeat of imperialism quite forcefully. Of course, the imperialists don't care about that when you are an isolated force and you don't have any connection with the masses. When your words, of course, start to resonate with the masses, it's at that point they start doing things like threatening you with arrest. So, because, of course, the Trotskyites in Britain don't have that understanding, that's why, to re-emphasize the point, they led the anti-war movement back then down a complete fucking dead end. Right, let's pause to take in questions from the chat. Right. Okay. Where are we? Pulgasari joined at the point of the Zizek impression. Very good. Hope you enjoyed it. Ian Foster, good evening to you, comrade. He says, there was little mention in Western media of violence, Croat ethnic cleansing of the predominantly Serbian region of the country. That's very true. Krajina. Putin's shirt said, I read something a few years ago, why were Albanians there at all? It reminded me of Israel, that Albanians had fled their country and Serbs welcomed them with open arms, just as Palestinians once did with Jews. Does anyone know why Albanians may have fled their homeland? Are you referring to why there was Albanians in Kosovo? I would need to go and check that for sure. So let me make a note of that question and come back to it. Good afternoon to Martin, who joins us, and Battle Cossack, who says, what are my thoughts on the ERP and the Montoneros in Argentina? Interesting question. I'm going to see if you the same answer, which is I don't know enough about the Montoneros to give you a clear answer on that, and I'm not going to freestyle it and try and make something up. So again, let me make a note of your question and come back to it. I can probably answer your question tomorrow, Battle Cossack, if I've had some time to look into it, or I can put it into a longer Q&A session if you let me know how you'd prefer me to address it in the near future. Daryl Davis says, Enver Hoxha said Mao was an agent of imperialism. That kind of stuff happens. It happens when there's confusion and division, as there was a lot in the 60s in the international communist movement, principally started by Khrushchev, but Hoxha also made his mistakes. Grassy Knoll says, please explain why Christopher Hitchens was for the destruction of Yugoslavia. Hitchens, as a Trotskyite, had always, well, I don't know if he did always oppose Yugoslavia, but he essentially took the Trotskyite position to its logical conclusion, which was that imperialism was now the more progressive force than what Trotsky and his followers, such as Max Shachtman, declared to be a bureaucratic deformation. And so once you've decided that all existing socialism is a bureaucratic deformation, And he's not only an error, but he's now actually a barrier to real socialism, and is horrifically oppressive, which is what Trotsky and his followers always said of the Soviet Union under Stalin, and later as well, was that it was horrifically oppressive, that there was no individual freedom. Of course, this is something that was untrue in many respects, where the people who were being suppressed in the Stalin era were largely the counter-revolutionaries. But Trotsky, in his usual way, took a pro-fascist position. Remember, Trotsky was arguing for the breakup of the Soviet Union in the late 1930s, and his followers were later found to have been collaborating with Ukrainian fascists. That's why he was calling for the breakup of the Soviet Union and the breakaway of Ukraine. Now, to go forward to why did Hitchens rabidly support the breakup of Yugoslavia? He had transitioned from a sort of fake socialist, a Trotskyite, to being like an open sort of pro-imperialist liberal by the early 1990s. He was a complete believer in the end of history theory, though I think he would have argued that he didn't quite believe in it as fervently as Fukuyama did, but certainly his political actions imply that he strongly did believe that the final form of human civilization was so-called Western democracy, i.e., the bourgeois democracy that exists under U.S. imperialism. And so he argued that the progressive thing to do was to argue for the exporting of that model to Yugoslavia and the breaking up of the Yugoslav state, and of course the bombing of those terrible Serbs who were persecuting the innocent Croats and Muslims. Of course, there's various different examples of persecution and massacre to go around in that war. Serbs were guilty of some of it. Croats were guilty of some of it. Bosnian Muslims were guilty of some of it. However, Hitchens went over to Sarajevo and did this sort of ridiculous stunts with people like Bono, proclaiming that Bosnia was the center of resistance against tyranny. And if you look at Hitchens' statements from the time, you can see that basically he belongs to, already by that stage, the group of hyper-aggressive US imperialists who are identified by some people as neocons, many of whom, of course, have an intellectual tradition or come from the intellectual tradition of American Trotskyism. And if you read, as I did years ago, unfortunately, Hitchens' book, Notes to a Young Contrarian, you can see in there like his justification for the breakup of Yugoslavia, his full embrace of like imperialist cosmopolitanism. And we're going to be doing tomorrow's episode on cosmopolitanism, so be sure to join me then. But yeah, he supported it because it was essentially the end point, the final development of his Trotskyism into rabid pro-US imperialist positions, which of course he maintained into the 2000s. Daryl Davis says worker self-management created huge imbalances. Northern Yugoslavia was already industrial and had that history, so worker self-management was relevant to them. Southern Yugoslavia didn't have an industrial legacy and it lagged behind. Interesting point. When we come to a more detailed Yugoslav history, we'll have to, of course, go into that much further. Yepex says, hello everyone, I had a couple of questions. I'm struggling to find a simple definition of what a Trotskyist is. Can you explain it quickly? Also, are there books that cover why Trots are not allies? Yes, I can. What I'll do is, I believe you've emailed me before, so I will email you some book suggestions on your question, YepX. To give you a very quick definition of what a Trotskyite is, a Trotskyite is somebody who rejects the idea that the Soviet Union, China, Cuba, or Albania, or any of the actually existing socialist countries in the 20th century actually were socialist. They call all of these countries, well, it depends upon which variety of Trotskyist you're talking to, a bureaucratic deformation, a proletarian Bonapartism, all kinds of insults. But basically, what a Trotskyist does is say that none of these are socialism, none of these represent workers' states, and what that leads them down the road to doing is supporting imperialism in various different ways. Some are more crude about it, like the Alliance for Workers' Liberty in Britain are just openly pro-imperialist. Some are a little bit more subtle, like the Socialist Party or the SWP, where they'll, as I said earlier, they will agree with all the things that, say, let's use Russia as an example. The Trotskyites will agree with all the things that the US imperialists say about Putin, that he's a gangster, that he's a murderer, that he's a thug, that he runs a personal dictatorship, that he has 50 different doubles, that he's been dead for 6 years. All those things, that he murders people with Novichok. All that stuff the Trotskyists will repeat. And then right at the end of their article, they will say, oh, but there shouldn't be a war in Ukraine. But Putin's as much to blame as the US is. Or some of them will say that. But they've spent the entire article agreeing with the points, the lies, told by US imperialism. And so where does that leave the reader of the article? And this is why I say some of them are more subtle than others. If you're reading an article supposedly from a communist organization, and that article spends the entire body of its text making the same points as US imperialism does in its propaganda, but at the very end says, oh yeah, but you know, it's 6 of one and half a dozen of the other in Ukraine, it's an inter-imperialist war, you've got two clashes of two imperialisms. Where does that lead and indeed leave the reader of that article? What political action are they supposed to take if what the Trotskyist organization has told them is that, well, Putin and US imperialism are as bad as each other? Some of them will concede that, well, US imperialism is bigger, but Putin's a regional imperialist, which of course isn't true. I mean, if you look at the Russian military doctrine, for instance, and I would recommend the recent book written on this by the former Swiss military intelligence officer, Jacques Beau. You can see that the way in which both the Soviet and the later Russian army is designed is to fight big defensive wars against the imperialist powers. How is the US military designed? To be spread out all over the world fighting colonial wars to ensure that the US retains military and economic domination over various different subjugated peoples. And that's a very short way of just analyzing, well, if you look at the military doctrine of both countries, you can see clearly which one is the defensive one, which one is the aggressive one. And look at all the moves. I mean, we're rehashing old arguments here, but a Trotskyist won't do that. A Trotskyist won't do the breakdown of the Russian economy. They'll just say Russia's imperialist. It exports capital, but they won't look at what that capital is. They won't look at the capital exports from Russia are actually money sent by the Russian capitalist class to banks in Cyprus or to buy property elsewhere, or at least that's what it used to be before that was closed off or restricted for them. So a Trotskyite is all of those things. I'll email you some links to some of the best books critiquing Trotskyism, Yep-X, so stand by to receive those later on or early tomorrow. David Green says, for the record, John Lee Anderson's reporting in the New Yorker was abysmal. Well, I didn't read his reporting, David, to be fair. I enjoyed his biography of Che Guevara. If I read it again now, would I view it in the same way? I mean, it's 20 years since I read it. I know that he's been associated with some very dodgy stuff as well, politically speaking. But I think that to be fair, the biography of Che is pretty solid. A lot of very exhaustive research and detail in there. Gela Nikolov joins us. Good to have you with us. And Trid says, yeah, the bloody KFOR, that's the occupation force put into Kosovo. I will never forget that name. Yeah, it's of course worth emphasizing that, of course, when the US imperialists got their way and put their force into Kosovo, what followed under the Kosovan puppet state was the ethnic cleansing of the Serb population. So everything they say, just flip it round. When they say they want to stop ethnic cleansing, what they mean is they want to go in and do ethnic cleansing. When they say they're going in to stop mass rapes, they're actually going in to commit mass rapes. I mean, it's a very effective tweet was put out to that effect by the Australian writer Catlin Johnson earlier on, which basically just using the Israelis as the example. But I think for imperialism, it's like you just flip their reasoning and you can find the truth. And the fate of the Serb population in Kosovo is very much a case of that. They said they wanted to prevent a genocide. They went in and a mass population expulsion, mass ethnic cleansing happened. And it wasn't an accident either. People will say, oh, they didn't mean it. This is a big thing you get the defenders of imperialism saying, as if all of this just happens by accident. To paraphrase Michael Parenti, it's the old argument that the British acquired an empire by accident, not by design. The US ended up ethnically cleansing the Serb population of Kosovo by accident. Oh, it just happened. It just happened in a place that we militarily occupy, whose government we completely control, and who has a giant statue of Bill Clinton in Pristina. And we're the ones calling all the shots. But it just happened that we couldn't stop a mass expulsion of the Serb population. Who would have thought it? If you believe that, you still believe in the fucking tooth fairy. President Jesus says, I believe Chomsky didn't say shit about it until it was well over. Yeah, he wrote a book declaring that the war was illegal, I believe, later on in 2000. I don't know what he says about it at the time. Probably not very much. Zuleika says, Trots are notorious counter-revolutionaries, like to the core, the fact they can't even support Cuba. Yeah, they can't even support Cuba. Like Trots who I think it's some exiled Trots who run the DSA now. They can't even just support Cuba without denouncing the horrendous Stalinists that run it. They're disgusting counter-revolutionary swines. Geli Nikolov says 2 to 3 million Bulgarians left permanently after 1989. Yeah, it's the destruction of nations. That's what capitalist restoration brings, as we've covered many times before. Trotskyite says, Harry, are socialists to oppose every attempt that has been made to build socialism in the real world? Very effective definition. Geli Nikolov says, nearly 9 million in Bulgaria, just over 6 million in 35 years. Yeah, the restoration of capitalism in countries like Bulgaria, the former Yugoslavia, the Baltic states, Poland has led to population collapse, industrial destruction, asset stripping. It's a complete counter-revolutionary disaster for the workers and peasants of those countries. Niosu says, Yugoslavia disassembled because it was only held together by the figure of Tito. After Tito, the whole thing fell apart mainly because of the internal problems and nationalistic identities in the federation. Yeah, we're going to have to go further into this, obviously. There's a lot to be said about the constitutional changes in the 1970s that we need to go into in a lot more detail. Clinton Frazier says, if I remember correctly, the EU's social chapter was dropped as part of a deal between UK and Germany over recognition over Slovenia and Croatia. Yeah, the social chapter was never implemented in Britain, I think, or it wasn't in the 90s. I'm not sure. I need to check up on that. But the government opted out of it, and that might have been the way they secured that opt out. I think Blair and the Labour Party might have put us back into it. But again, the social chapter for us didn't mean a great deal because none of the supposedly pro-worker stuff was ever really implemented in this country. Jenny says all these bad guys may as well rig elections because the US is going to accuse them of it anyway. Yes. Geli Nikolov says in 1991 Sofia had no water and there was financial collapse in 96. Yeah. Again, like, restoration of capitalism everywhere was a complete disaster. Grassy Knoll says, did Gaddafi give up nuclear systems? No, he didn't have a nuclear program. That was always a lie. I mean, Libya had some chemical weapons programs, I think, but there was no nuclear program that was viable. But again, like, on reflection, taking that deal was a way of imperialism disarming Libya. To an extent, it disarmed the country ideologically. It grew corrupt elements inside the country, It weakened the support that the government had amongst the population due to the growth of corruption. Like, deals with imperialism only lead to negative consequences, even if they don't agree, don't invade you straight away. And Jenny correctly points out there is no compromise with imperialism. The only way you can ever have any sort of compromise with imperialism is if you are strong enough to essentially scare them off. So the Soviet Union, until the late 70s, even into the 80s, was a strong enough country, industrially and militarily, to make imperialism have to periodically sign bargains with them. But even then, the liberals still wet themselves with delight over the détente process. The détente process in the late 60s, early 70s was about imperialism buying time for itself. They'd suffered a strategic defeat in Vietnam. They were weakened. They needed to essentially reorganize themselves and to pursue different tactics with regard to undermining the Soviet system. And the tactic they chose was détente, to increase the amount of, to go on to the topic we're going to cover tomorrow, people who were became of a cosmopolitan ideological outlook inside the Soviet Union, inside East Germany. We basically infiltrate and subvert rather than directly confront. That was what détente was all about. And so you see these liberals going, oh my God, détente was wonderful. Yeah, it was for the imperialists, because they managed to manage their defeat in Vietnam and rebuild their forces and further weaken the forces of revolution inside the USSR and the Eastern Bloc countries. Ian Foster says, imperialism is the prism through which we must view all international conflicts. Very true. Harry quotes Che saying, you cannot trust imperialism for a minute, not one iota. Very true. Abtin Kamoshi says, how do you view the Iran-Iraq war? To me, its similarity with Ukraine is striking. Interesting. I'm going to say, I do not know enough about the Iran-Iraq war, how it started. I know that imperialism was heavily involved in encouraging that war, hoping that they could crush Iran using Iraq, and then essentially crush Iraq afterwards, I think. But again, I need to go away and read more comprehensively about that before I offer a clear opinion on it. So, yeah. I'll have to come back to your question, Abtin. Be sure to email it to me in order that I don't forget about it. What were the important achievements of the Yugoslav economy? Well, I think they achieved a certain degree of self-sufficiency. They did build a domestic car industry. They built up a domestic military industry, which was quite impressive. Like, if you look at, for nerdish reasons, I follow a lot of the accounts on Telegram tracking weapons on the black market that turn up, weapons that are used by rebel groups. The amount of Yugoslav zastavas which are still used is quite incredible, really. They apparently, according to the things I've seen, they built up the domestic military industrial base to quite an impressive extent. Again, they had a domestic car industry that was, again, quite extensive. They, I believe that Yugoslav agriculture got steadily more efficient as well, but I'm not completely up to date on my reading on that, so others may have better information on that. So there were certain industrial successes there. And again, there were the social successes of increased life expectancy, increased literacy rate, all of which is, of course, incredibly important in any socialist system. But yeah, we will return in the future to do an episode on Yugoslav economy. Hitchens called North Korea fascist, says David Matthew. Yeah, well, I'm going to call Hitchens a Trotskyite cunt. So there you go. Trot's a neocon every time, says Jenny. And I do mean that in the most, about Hitchens. man was despicable. There's a reason why he's mourned by the bourgeoisie. He was a bourgeois intellectual to the absolute fucking core. Despicable man. Supported mass murder and dressed it up in like moral fucking outrage about confected, made up crimes. A despicable propagandist. A repulsive representative of the British bourgeois intelligentsia. Can't say enough bad words about that guy. Lertis says another Trotskyite term is state capitalism. Yes. Pioneered by one of the granddaddies of British Trotskyism, a certain Mr. Tony Cliff, who argued that the USSR was actually capitalist as early as 1948. Mutanda says, so looking at the Corbyn years, were the right of Labour who would sneer at the Corbynites and call them trots, do these people not actually understand what a trot is? Well, to a large extent, the right and the left had all in the Labour Party had a lot to do with Trotskyism, but a lot of them in the Corbyn section were trots. Like there were a lot of Trotskyists, including me at the time, back in 2016-17, who was considered myself an active Trotskyite who was supporting Corbyn. And Trotskyites basically spend some of their time screaming in an ultra-left fashion and collapse into social democracy almost immediately afterwards. So it wasn't actually a completely inaccurate accusation, but the Labour right and the Labour left always have far more in common than they actually divides them when it comes down to it. Corbyn's most rabid critics and Corbyn himself actually have quite a lot in common. Even the difference is, whereas his critics were out and proud, naked imperialists, Corbyn offers sort of watery pacifism, which is completely ineffectual. And he actively, in his time in the Stop the War Coalition, sought to block more militant anti-imperialist actions. So I have no time for Corbyn, to be completely honest. Right, where are we? Gleb says, I used to like Hitchens as a teen. So did I, as an 18-year-old. But we live and learn, don't we? David Matthew says, Parenti's book in Yugoslavia is good. It's an excellent book, actually. David Matthew also says, Chomsky taught at West Point. Yeah, I bet he did. He's very much an in-house intellectual. And Jenny's right. If Gaddafi did have nuclear weapons, he'd still be around. That's why the DPRK was absolutely right to pursue them and absolutely right to keep them. And that's part of the reason why imperialism dare not intervene, because the DPRK has means by which it can inflict pain on imperialism. And that's the only way you stop them. You don't stop them by making deals with them. And that's, again, become... Everybody has seen that now. No one will, or no one should, sign any kind of deal with these characters. Slightly off topic, asks Luca, any good sources to understand the actions of Abu Nidal? It's a good question, Luca. I'm going to have to take that one away. I've heard things about Abu Nidal, and that he might have been under the influence of Mossad and the United States. That's why he carried out so many sectarian attacks on other Palestinian resistance forces. But I don't have a confirmed source on that, so I'm going to have to come back to you on that particular question. Paul Gassari says the kind of sophistry they teach you on PPE courses is dangerous. Yep. Trotskyism is a cult. Very true. Martin says, I remember way back when Hitchens was a regular writer at The Nation, back when he was still a leftist. Lots of swooning over George Orwell. Hang on. Yeah. Whenever you hear Orwell's name, spit. Another complete piece of garbage that should be consigned to the bin. Chomsky is also anti-communist and believes abortion is murder. Is Chomsky anti-abortion? I've never come across that. Right. Zuleika says, Parenti is a great writer, very easy to read, witty, and most importantly, informative. Yeah. Michael Parenti is one of the great working class American intellectuals, very much so. Okay, so I'm going to leave it there for this evening. My thanks to all 289 of you who are viewing so far and have been with us through this. Very good to have you with us. I'll be back again tomorrow where we're going to be doing a show on the issue of cosmopolitanism and the ideology of US imperialism in the post-1991 period. So please join me for that. Till then, thank you to everybody who's joined in, and I'll be back with you again tomorrow.